Thank you all. Applause at the last minute is always hugely appreciated. Welcome to tonight's debate. This house would design its own baby. This debate is our quote-unquote science debate of term. And the reason we don't have more science debates per term is because it's very difficult to find a motion that has both a proposition and an opposition and doesn't get incredibly dense for humanities students. So this is the culmination of that effort. So just for reference, who's a science student? Put your hand up. Whoa. That has literally never happened here. So well done. You've done really well. You to be applauded. Good luck with having jobs. So the debate tonight is an important one. It is an important moral issue. With scientific progress fast outstripping the pace of ethical discussion, the Union is now debating whether to prepare for a future where it could design its own child. If you're joining us online, tonight's hashtag is #CussBaby, which I accept has flaws, but is the only one really available to us at the time. If you would like to tweet us with your comments or questions, I will do my best to read them out if they are of worth. If you'd like to contribute to tonight's debate, you can do so. There are many ways you can do so. If you look on the back of your order papers, you will see there are many methods. If you would like to make a point during somebody's speech, you can stand up and say on that point or point of information, and at that point, the speaker has the choice as to whether or not to accept your point. And the only rule is that the point has to be something to do with what the speaker has just said. So you cannot ask them what their favorite color is or just something completely off topic. It has to be what they've just been talking about. In between the first pair and the second pair of speakers, we will do a floor round. So that's the chance for you to make a speech in proposition, opposition, or abstention. And with that, we now turn to tonight's debate. So to welcome the case for the proposition is Robin Lovell-Badge. Robin is the group leader and head of the Division of Stem Cell Biology and Development Genetics at the Francis Crick Institute. Robin.
Okay, you actually could ask what's my favorite color eye, because that's a relevant question. But anyway. So why are we having this debate? This is actually a debate that's happened many, many times over many decades. In fact, every time there's some new development in science that's relevant, so which could be in vitro fertilization, it could be making animals that are genetically modified animals with a variety of different techniques. Whether that's transgenic animals or whether it's embryonic stem cells, whether it's cloning, the topic comes up again. It also comes up whenever there's a bit of science fiction that's relevant, which can be Brave New World or it could be Gattaca or whatever. But why we're having a debate today is because there's new technology which actually makes it possible. So in the past, scientists have been able to say, oh, there's no point in even worrying about this because it's too unreliable, too difficult to do, unsafe, we don't need to have a conversation. But now, I think we do need to have this conversation because there's this new techniques called genome editing, where you can very efficiently and precisely alter DNA sequences, so alter the basis of genes. You can subtract parts of the gene, you could add parts of a gene or whole genes, you can change them, you can alter the genes using this technology, and the most efficient of these technologies is referred to as CRISPR-Cas9. It actually comes from a bacterial immune system, which I really don't have time to go into, but it's a very impressive system. But it can be adapted to use in any animal or plant cell, and by any animal cell, I mean including humans. And it relies on having a little guide, which can find the specific DNA sequence you want to alter, and it brings with it an enzyme that cuts DNA at precisely that point. And then the mechanism relies on normal processes that occur in the cell to repair damaged DNA. Our DNA is constantly getting damaged. Every time a cell divides, DNA gets damaged and has to be repaired. And this process hijacks that mechanism. So it repairs the DNA, and as it repairs it, it can either leave behind a little mutation, or if you add a DNA template in there, you can alter the DNA sequence to precisely how you design it. So we're using this technique in my lab in mice. It's being used all around the world in a variety of different organisms, say plants and animals. And there was a paper published in April from a lab in China where they attempted to use it for the first time in human embryos. The intention wasn't to allow these embryos to develop, but just to see whether the techniques worked. And if they work as well as they do in human embryos as they do in animals, this will be an amazingly efficient technique and precise. So, what sort of things might you use this technique for? Well, there are things like, obviously, trying to avoid having children affected by genetic disease. So, currently, the technology that's used to avoid having genetically affected children is called preimplantation genetic diagnosis, or other forms of prenatal diagnosis, where you biopsy an early embryo and choose an embryo that is going to be free from the disease and only implant that and allow that to develop. But you can't use that technique in all cases because there'll be some individuals where you could never find a normal embryo to transfer back. So, for example, there are rare individuals who are homozygous for nasty dominant diseases like Huntington's disease. So they cannot possibly have an unaffected child. So you could use this method to correct the mutation. In fact, some would argue, ethically, maybe it's better to correct an embryo than throw it away. Actually, even the previous Pope agreed that this was a better thing to do. So that is one argument. You could use it to deal with the risk of having a disease. So there are a number of gene variant alleles that are associated with particular diseases, such as the ApoE4 allele is strongly linked with the chances of getting Alzheimer's. So you could use the method to change the ApoE4 allele into ApoE2 or 3, which might be protective. So that's another use. And then there's a whole range of different types of forms of enhancement that you could think of. And that ranges from the sort of milder forms of enhancement, maybe people would think more acceptable, things like disease resistance. So there are rare individuals who cannot get AIDS because the HIV virus can't bind to a particular protein on the surface of blood cells and infect their cells. It's a protein called CCR5. And it doesn't happen because they have a mutant version of that protein. And actually, clinical trials just starting in the US using somatic gene therapy to try and treat AIDS patients by mutating that receptor. But what if you wanted to say, I want to guarantee my children can't get infected by HIV? So you could, in theory, mutate the CCR5 gene in your children, and so that they would be protected. You could do the same thing for a number of other diseases, infectious diseases, perhaps influenza, perhaps Ebola. That's one perhaps slightly kinder way of talking about enhancement. You could then go to other traits that you find naturally in people. So you could think about enhancement, bigger muscles, run faster, all these sorts of things. You could talk about eye color, hence the question, what's your favorite color? You could, in theory, do anything that we understand the genetics well enough that you could modify an embryo such that the resulting child had that trait. Of course, we don't understand lots of things. We don't understand how to do many of these things. So people always talk about having, I want to have, a child who is athletic and tall and blonde and blue-eyed and very intelligent. Well, we don't know enough about intelligence to be able to alter the genes. But one day, perhaps we will. There are huge projects going on involving big genome projects. So there's the 100,000 Genome Project going on in the UK, which is going to link genes with lifestyle, with diseases, life history, and perhaps eventually we will understand enough about genomics to be able to make changes we want to make. So isn't it a bit far-fetched? Why would we want to enhance things like this? Well, of course, we're always, parents are always looking to ways to enhance their children's future, whether it's sending them to institutions like this, paying for piano lessons, whatever. Always, parents are trying to come to the best thing for their children. So why not give them slightly better genes? In fact, probably some couples only get together because they recognize that the partner has the sorts of genes they want their children to have. And I'm going to just give a little quotation from Cornelia Georgiou, who's a Romanian scientist, who was a scientist who synthesized piracetam in the mid-1960s, and then showed that it has an effect of cognitive enhancement. So there are lots of drugs now that can be used for cognitive enhancement. And he said, man is not going to wait passively for millions of years before evolution offers him a better brain. Well, if we could do it chemically, shouldn't we do it genetically? And then finally, there's the other forms of enhancement that we might need to use, and that's not using human genes, but using genes from other organisms to allow us to cope better with our environment, especially as the environment changes due to global warming or if an asteroid hits the Earth or whatever. Maybe we will have to alter our genes at some time in the future just to be able to survive. And whether that's allowing us to see in the dark, which is perfectly feasible, taking photoreceptors that sense infrared and putting them in human embryos. Or allow us to eat food that humans don't normally eat. You know, there are far too many cows eating the grass. Why don't we eat the grass ourselves? Maybe we could tweak human genes to allow us to do that. And then there's the even more crazy thing, like, well, why don't we photosynthesize? Then we don't have to eat at all. So the imagination can run wild with this. But let's go back to the beginning. These techniques are happening. People are developing them. They're incredibly powerful for basic research. And they are being used around the world for basic research. And so just starting is the idea of using these techniques to understand how very early human embryo development works. And we're going to get a lot of information out of that, which might be very useful in understanding how we develop, how to prevent miscarriage, how to improve implantation failure, and things like this. So the techniques are very valuable, even if used on early human embryos. They are being used, as I mentioned, for a variety, or the idea is to use them for a variety of somatic gene therapies. It's spawned already a huge industry in Europe and in the US in particular, and other parts of the world, where investors are investing in this technology for somatic gene therapy. But perhaps rather than having to treat every individual each time, why don't we use them to eradicate some pretty nasty diseases like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease? So how am I doing for time? 1 minute. So you will see a lot of debates are just beginning in many countries around the world. So this is, again, a really timely occasion. So I was at a meeting in Amsterdam last week, in Washington, D.C. 4 weeks ago. I'm going back to Washington, D.C. in a couple of weeks' time for an even bigger debate. So it's really important that everyone debates this because, of course, decisions of whether these things go forward isn't just due to scientists alone. It has to involve others. It has to involve society and whether they would accept these technologies or not. So I'm going to stop there.
Robin, thank you. A couple of things before we move on. First of all, again, I do encourage you to make points of information or to interrupt at any point. This is no longer a science lecture. We do encourage you to question the question the speaker, question whatever you like. I'm a humanities student. This comes naturally to me. But do interrupt as you like. Second of all, tonight's hashtag, having typed it into Twitter, I've discovered that unfortunately cuss baby could also be pronounced cos baby. Now, the result of that has been I've got people tweeting saying things about their girlfriends, such as, hold on tight, don't let me go onto the world we're making, hashtag cuz baby, when the ground starts shaking, you got to know when you've got a good thing. So I've got about 100 of these, which means it's physically impossible for me to see anything, apart from one tweet from Charlie Thorpe, who says, hashtag cuss baby, do you think the selection of good genes in potential partners is a conscious decision? manipulating genes is, which is something to consider as we go on. Aside from that, please do tweet at Cambridge Union and screw the hashtag, because apparently that's really not going to work tonight. But to continue with tonight's debate, we have Shirley Hodgson. Shirley is a leading British geneticist and a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. She currently works at St George's, University of London. Shirley.
Is that all right? Cry from the heart. Oh, it is. Okay, that's good. Well, I don't think I would want it to be stable. And that was all. But clearly that's a very important issue. And so we know a lot about a lot of genetic are caused by single mutations, single genes. And they are very important. And already we've got gene therapy coming on for some of those since the 1990s. And also, as you mentioned, the IVF and pre-implantation diagnosis and genetic diagnosis in utero to try and identify fetuses that have these disorders. And at the moment, with that, you have an embryo which has or hasn't got the gene. Now, if I had Alzheimer's, or, well, no, I'd say Huntington's maybe, I would have a 50-50 chance of having a child with the same condition. And so I might have several embryos, and I would then choose the ones that didn't have Huntington's and allow those to carry on and discard the ones that did. And that, of course, is a worry ethically. But then I don't know that this CRISPR technique actually completely gets us away from that, because at the moment, the technique, as it was done in China anyway, is not completely efficient. So you would take an embryo and you would try and correct a particular genetic fault, but you would only correct it in maybe 40%, 20% of the cells. And of course, you might throw up some other mutations which you didn't want, and you might not find out about until the baby was grown up or something. And you're also discarding embryos in that way. So you're just waiting for an embryo that's got the disease and then seeing what you can do with that. Whereas at the moment, with pre-implantation diagnosis, you are just selecting the ones that don't have the mutation, which does at the moment seem rather more simple. But those things only apply to the single gene disorders, and they are quite rare. Only about 1% of live-borns have single gene problems. And all the other diseases that we're thinking of, diabetes, high blood pressure, masses of them, you can think of them, are caused by multifactorial inheritance, if you like. So that means that there's an environmental impact, and there's also probably the effect of 10, 20 different genes which are affecting the susceptibility to that. My field is cancer genetics, and I'm sure you probably all know that there are 1 or 2 genes which, if there's a mutation, makes people very, very susceptible to breast cancer. But if it's not those particularly strong genes, the susceptibility to breast cancer is much more due to maybe 20, as I say, other genes which confer just a small susceptibility, perhaps a 10% increase in risk at most. So on their own, those genes don't really have much impact on the susceptibility to breast cancer. And so you'd be tinkering away with an awful lot of genes if you wanted to reduce my susceptibility to breast cancer by this technology. Then there are other things about it. We do know that some, again, in cancer genetics, some genes which protect you against breast cancer actually make you a little bit more susceptible to some other cancers. And we know a lot of other examples of that kind of thing. For instance, people with the serious blood disorder, sickle cell disease, if they have it, if they're only carriers of it, they are actually resistant to malaria. So there are sort of benefits from some of these unpleasant genes. And there's a recent book which was looking at a slightly increased risk of autism in the children of the Silicon Valley scientists, who obviously are very brilliant. So there may be an association between people who are very brilliant in that way and also autistic. And we've already heard perhaps before about schizophrenia in families where there's very high creativity. And some suggestion that if you're resistant to certain infections, you may be susceptible to autoimmune disease. So it's not always very straightforward and very clear-cut. So disease prevention is perhaps much more straightforward in the single gene disorders, but in the other ones, a little bit more difficult. So what about the idea of having a wonderful, ideal child? Well, of course, the idea of having children with desirable characteristics has, as you said, been going around for a long time. Galton in 1869 said it would be possible to produce a highly gifted race of men by judicious marriages through several consecutive generations. So they were always thinking about it. But of course, you all know that the counter of that was later on with, dare I say it, with Nazi Germany and that kind of thing, where people were actually going around and sterilizing people who they thought had undesirable traits. That is always a bit of a concern. So, and then think about it. If you want, if I asked all of you to say what kind of wonderful baby you would want if you were allowed to diagnose, to design your own baby, what would you think of? What are the good characteristics? You know, healthy, handsome, fertile, clever, courageous, etc. But then, in order to be successful and happy, you don't not just need the intelligence, you also need the drive and the personality to be able to use those characteristics to the best of your ability. You might have a terribly brilliant child, but if they just lie in bed and don't do anything all the time, then it might not be terribly helpful. And also we know that some traits which are useful in some climates or environments will be helpful, and in others they won't. For instance, the genes that make you survive in the Arctic may not be very helpful if you live in the tropics. And we know there's a very good example of that with the pigmentation of the skin. It's very useful to have dark pigmentation if you live in hot, sunny places, but it's not so good if you're living in a cold and dark place where you might find that you weren't making enough vitamin D and you would get rickets. And so the environment has a great deal of effect on the sort of genetic factors that are useful to you. So having said all that, let's say we're successful. Let's say we can produce these ideal creatures that we really all want. What are the other things that are going to be left, that we're going to be left thinking about? So first thing is, of course, the baby hasn't consented to all these manipulations. And at the moment with genetic counseling, we do take very great care to ask that people make their own decisions about genetic counseling and being aware of what genes they have. And you don't give the baby much chance in this particular case. The next thing is, of course, that these changes are heritable. Once you've made the change in an embryo using CRISPR technique or whatever, their children will also have these problems or corrections. And if it happens to be if they've got a correction that doesn't actually work very well, then their children are going to have a chance of inheriting that too. Then there's another problem. It's going to be a really expensive thing to do, I'm sure. Sort of £100,000 I was looking at something today in the news. It'll obviously get cheaper, but it's going to be very complicated. And so it's unlikely that you're going to be able to offer this to the whole population. And so there would be a gap between rich and poor. And of course, there's already a gap between rich and poor, and that would just make it worse. Another thing is, would it reduce our tolerance of people who are less gifted or they're disadvantaged in some way, and so that you wouldn't be able to appreciate the qualities that people have that aren't so brilliant? And I do think that is a worry. It's already a bit of a worry, and it might become more so if we were going for these perfect babies. And of course, the last thing here is that we don't just live in a vacuum. We live in a society. So if my husband and I decide we want children of this particular kind, and it becomes quite fashionable to have children with these various qualities, it's not really what society may need. Society needs a variety of people with all sorts of different traits and abilities. And if you're all going to sort of be alpha males or something, it may not be terribly helpful to the society survival. And in fact, a variable society, there was a Fisher in 1930 said that the energy of the species was dependent on having a variety of different types of person within it. So really, just to finish, there was a quote that I found from a geneticist I knew quite well in 1970. He said, "I'd rather live in a genetically imperfect society which preserves human standards of life than in one where people are not appreciated and all the heredity is perfect." Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, no mic. We'll get there. Wait for it. There I am. Okay, good. Thank you very much. We now have time for a round of floor speeches. So would anybody like to make a speech in proposition? Yes, Richard.
Richard Parkins, Trinity College. Is this on?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I'm reminded of the advert that appeared on the sides of London buses some while ago. For all I know, may still be there. Whether you like it or not, it's going to happen. Get used to it.
Nope, okay. And in opposition? Opposition. Yes, just down there.
Hi, I'm Aaron Chen from Downing College, first year natural scientist. I think that, well, in the future, it can work, the engineered baby, but it has to overcome a lot of problems. And I think one of the most severe one, as it's mentioned a little bit before, it's about the gap between the rich people and the poor people. I think it's not only getting worse, but it's getting very huge. That's a gap we can never get across. Like, think about it. If only the richest people can engineer the baby, and we as a generation from the ordinary ones, can we get to University Cambridge, like such a place? Since they got like higher IQ, higher EQ, and whatever, like better than us, and their children will still be like even better than us. And I think this will be a gap that we can never get across until we find some maybe solution to, well, solve this problem, not a scientific one, but a social one. Thank you.
And an abstention? Yes, just there.
Keir and Emmanuel. I think the main question that we really have to ask ourselves is that if the technology ever does become good enough that we are happy with it, then it's what do we change? And I think a lot of the time we've been talking about enhancements, and I personally would say IQ, no. And any kind of physical characteristics, I think the only thing, I suppose this is kind of a proposition point, but I think it's kind of in the between, is that we should only ever consider changing diseases if they seriously affect the embryo's life. Because then, although we have the issue of consent, if we know that this disease is going to ravage someone's life, then we do have a responsibility to take it out. And I think that's the only time we can ever use this technique. But then that raises the question of what is a disease? And actually what we've seen from the one-child policy in China is that being female is seen as not as good. And we've seen lots of female abortions. And I will also raise the question is that in conservative societies, as we begin to discover more about there is a thought process that maybe there is genes that predispose people to be gay or things like that. And I know that being bisexual myself, if my parents ever found that out and decided that actually that's not something that I wanted, I think that's really, really dangerous. And that's why we need to be very, very kind of regulate these things very carefully, say what is actually a disease in our society.
Another speech in proposition. Proposition? Yes, go ahead.
Anton Węgrowski, Trinity Hall. I'd like first to take back on the example of China, where, so as you know, there is this one-child policy. Most of the time when a baby girl is born, in many cases the baby girl is killed or there is an abortion, which results in an overpopulation of males. So what is the situation here in China? It's that in the middle of in the countryside, we have overpopulation of males. What is the result? Well, people get, they deal with it, and you see a lot of polyandry happening. That is a couple of men marrying a woman to deal with this problem. Is this a bad thing? Is this a good thing? It depends on your opinion, but I would say that it's just a change, and that people will accept this change. So the same thing with when everybody will have access to being able to design their own baby. Society will change, and people who will be born in this society will accept society as it is. So I wouldn't say that it's a bad thing. I would support the proposition. Thank you.
And in opposition? Yeah, Dan. Okay, well then let's not. Otherwise it'll break all the rules and the house falls down, then just let's not. Opposition? Yes, just up there.
Fergus Powell, Sydney Sussex College. Building on the point that the gentleman over there made for the opposition, I think even once we've restricted ourselves that we're just talking about diseases as in actual genetic disorders, there's still a risk of becoming very ableist. So a couple of the diseases mentioned, for example, cystic fibrosis. There are actually ways now that cystic fibrosis can be treated quite well. And you know, people with cystic fibrosis and many other genetic disorders can still live very fulfilling lives. And I think to treat this, this disorder as something that we would want to eradicate from our society is very dangerous.
And finally, an abstention. Yeah.
Stefan Ulrich, Pembroke College. So in such a multifaceted question, I'm just going to highlight the topic of complex traits. So as the opposition correctly pointed out, it is often controlled by a number of genes. You don't know exactly how you're going to change it. At best, it will probably just turn into a slight probabilistic game of if we change this gene, it may be slightly more likely that our child will be more intelligent or more emotionally capable. And also there's the question of pluses and minuses. If we change a certain gene, we will alter a child for better or in many cases for worse in a different way. But then there's also a secondary point about the importance of development and how those genes get expressed, how the child uses the genes it has been given. And I think many of us know the effect of our parents pushing us to be something. it makes us not want to be that thing and not strive towards being that thing. So that's a point to consider before we talk about designing complex traits.
My parents wanted me to President of the Union, but yes. This returns us to tonight's debate. We have to take up the case for the opposition, Hilary Burton. Hilary is the director of the PhD Foundation, an independent non-profit genetics and policy think tank. She's also a fellow of Hughes Hall. Hilary.
This house would design its own baby. In speaking against this motion, I recognise it's a very broad phrase, and that in itself has provoked lots of argument about what might or might not be included. But I'm going to follow the other speakers and assume that what we're talking about is genome editing, the introduction of new genetic material into the genome. But I'm going to take a completely different perspective. My background is a public health physician, and we think about what's right or what's best for the health of the whole population and what sort of health care we offer to the population. And we think of the health of the population in terms of the physical and the mental health of population members, but also the well-being of society, such things as solidarity, equity, cohesion. And when considering healthcare provision, and I do see this as a service that would be mediated by professionals, health professionals, and people with serious laboratory science training, we have to think about it from the aspect of what will be provided by a state health service, such as the NHS, or some combination of state and private health services. I'm going to put aside arguments about the inherent ethical acceptability of designer babies and focus on the practical. I'm going to note a fine distinction between therapeutic intervention and enhancement, which is a classic part of the conundrum about genetic engineering in general. I recognise that there is a difference, but I don't think it's an important part of the argument today, because I'm going to argue that genome editing for any of these purposes is extremely unlikely to happen, except in really unusual circumstances. Because for ensuring that the population of babies are as healthy as possible, there are much better, safer, and more cost-effective interventions at a population level than genetic engineering. And with regard to positive enhancement, the practical implications for parents in going through with this and for societies in regulating it are such that I don't think this House would or should support it. So let's think first about the population viewpoint, and I'm going to ask two questions. Ought we as a society to be providing designer baby services for the population, for example on the NHS? If not providing this service, what considerations would be necessary before we allowed people to access it? Thinking about state healthcare provision first, what does this technology actually entail? How many of you realise that it actually requires that you undergo all the steps of IVF with some sort of molecular testing in the middle and replacement to put this replacement technology into the embryo once formed in a petri dish, and before attempts then to implant it. So don't forget that IVF itself requires suppression of normal cycles, which means hormone nasal sprays or injections, which take 2 to 3 weeks, ovarian stimulation, injections for 7 to 10 days, side effects such as hot flushes, scans, blood tests to monitor the progress, hormone injection, finally time to trigger egg release, egg collection under local anaesthetic, sperm sample, insemination, fertilization in the lab, embryo transfer, checking for the pregnancy, all the ups and downs of the establishment of the pregnancy. This is definitely not for the faint-hearted or those without strong motivations. For individuals, the difficulties, the risks, the emotionally draining experience. For healthcare, the cost, the capacity, GPs, maternity services, counselling, specialist advice, specialist IVF services, reproductive scientists, and so on and so forth. And for the broader population perspective, what are we trying to achieve? As public health people, we're trying to promote good health, and we need to think as a society, what's our best way of promoting healthy babies? We have 800,000 babies each year born in England and Wales, and there are better ways of making sure that population is healthy than thinking about genetic modifications. So if we're thinking about general health, for example, we think about things that might be focused on the population. If we look at the nice guidance on how to, on pregnancy and maternity care, there's preconception advice, making sure people take folic acid, making sure they don't smoke, advice on alcohol, illicit drugs, exposure to hazardous substances, exposure to radiation. At the preconception level, during antenatal care, again, advice on lifestyle, screening for maternal and fetal abnormalities, looking for clinical conditions such as gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, preterm birth, fetal growth restriction. Same goes on in perinatal care and neonatal care, a huge range of interventions to ensure the good health of the population. And I would argue that getting all of these elements right will have a much greater return for the population than considerations of enhancement from genetic engineering. If we move on to high risk of serious disease, again, at a population level, there are clearly important health needs that arise from the serious genetic conditions that we've heard about. So 1 in 17 of the population has a rare disorder, such as cystic fibrosis. But again, there are a range of preventive interventions, some of which are available as health services. So we've heard about preconception testing for carrier status. We've heard about prenatal testing with the option of termination of pregnancy. And I accept that that is a sort of negative design. We've heard about neonatal testing for early diagnosis. These are all ways of reducing the chance of couples having a seriously ill baby or finding disease very early and putting in effective treatments to improve the health of an affected child. And I've argued many times over my professional life that these are the sort of services that should be available to people at high risk. They aren't always available, and we should be putting those in place. Please note that when using preconception or prenatal genetic testing, the technology involves creating a number of embryos and choosing a healthy one, and it's only in extremely rare circumstances, such as mitochondrial transfer, that we might come anywhere near thinking about the notion of introducing different genetic material. So in public health terms, both for overall good health and in the context of serious genetic diseases, designing babies or introducing beneficial genetic material is not likely to be the way that we would go about improving the health of newborn babies, children, and the adults that they'll grow into, except possibly, and after much debate, in some very rare circumstances. So from the population viewpoint, I'm going to ask two questions. Ought we as a society to be providing designer baby services for the population on the NHS? Sorry, I'm on the wrong. Sorry. So for publicly funded services, the answer to designer babies is no. And that leads us to the second question, whether we wish to have a society in which couples can have designer babies if they're prepared to pay, and if so, how should that be regulated? So what would be the effect of a service being available to people who can afford to pay? I expect, again, these would be the rich, the assertive, those people that like to control their lives, who want to plan everything, including how and when they get pregnant. By creating designer babies, there's an argument that we risk calcifying the existing social stratification that is already in place, underpinning it with actual differences in the underlying genetic endowment of different groups. So let's assume, in the interest of equity, we also try to bring enhancement to the poorer people in society. Perhaps we can learn how to insert the gene for intelligence, although of course there'll be no such single gene. That would be a great way of trying to level up life chances through the population, but how are we going to do it? And what would such a policy entail? Proactively seeking out the poorer in society and demanding that they have the intelligence gene, but by the way, saying they can't have the aggression gene or the religious conviction gene or the addiction gene. I think all of these things would be incredibly difficult for us to regulate. And the question would be, how would we decide what traits would be acceptable and how would the decisions be made? I'm just going to finish up on a personal note. Of course, I'd have wanted my children to be as healthy as possible. And I'd have done everything I possibly could to avoid the birth of a seriously handicapped or ill child. but at present that wouldn't have involved genetic engineering. But the idea of choosing positive characteristics and the sheer pain, complexity, and cost of going through it seems to me to be quite ludicrous. I found it's really hard choosing anything for a baby. Even choosing a name feels like a huge responsibility. And I know I'd worry if I'd introduced the assertiveness gene that actually maybe that was what was underlying my son or daughter's aggressiveness. And even if the scientists told me it was safe and effective, I'd always worry as soon as anything went wrong. What on earth was happening at those joins on the DNA? And finally, perhaps because I'm not a tiger mother and I've been incapable of organising my children to do anything, but I realised when they were very little that I can't make them do anything or be anything that they don't choose for themselves. And it's, in fact, incredibly difficult and responsible being a parent, but it is very rewarding. So I've argued from a population perspective, it's simply impractical to be introducing the notion of designer babies, either for general health or for enhancement. And as a parent, I can assure you, there are cheaper, easier, and much more fun ways of getting pregnant and having children than going through the designer baby processes. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for one quick round of floor speeches, so proposition. Yeah, just there.
Hello, I'm Nai Rees from King's. I'm not a humanities student. I don't understand, I don't study society, but I hear a lot from the floor speakers and from the professional speakers. People are talking about this in terms of we. What decision does this house make? But I think the reality is that there is no powerful governing body that can make this decision. The reality of science in what is, in many cases, a capitalist society, if you look at the US, for instance, is that as an ethical scientist, you've got to look at the decision and think, should I do this? And if not, will my next competitor do it? Because there is no central body making these decisions. There are people that are subdivided in different groups. And therefore, I think it's important to point out that it's not really a question worth asking, should we do this, but really when will it happen? Because we can almost certain in saying that someone will try it at some point if the technology is available. And the technology continues to increase, and that's something that happens. So yeah, I thought it was important to point that out. One last thing, actually. I have two brothers that are twins of each other, monozygotic, so they're 100% genetically the same, and yet they are obviously not the same. Even with the power that genetics can bring us, I think it's important to remember as well that environments will continue to change what we try and tailor these babies to be. So the power is great with genetic changing of babies, but it's not going to be absolute. Even with this 50 years time, there's still going to be things that we cannot predict. So those are two things that I thought I'd point out. Thank you.
Thank you. And opposition? Opposition? Yeah, just there.
Thank you. I'm Hadis Durrani. I'm from Darwin College. I'd like to just respond to the contentions from the proposition, the sense that this is something inevitable. When I hear that, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. I think specifically of Hannah Arendt's work on totalitarianism, the banality of evil, and particularly Eichmann in Jerusalem, and him as a bureaucrat in the Nazi regime. And his reasoning was, well, someone is going to do what I'm doing, so it may as well be me. What does a difference make? And I know this is an extreme statement, but this is the kind of thinking that I think a lot of the scientists who are working on the atom bomb were thinking. So when I think about inevitability, sure, the Nazi regime was a regime that was working from the top down. It wasn't something decentralized like we have now. But I think in many ways it was also a result of the society and the culture that it produced. And I see that with the atom bomb as well, the culture of scientists that said, hey, someone's going to build a bomb, someone's going to work on this, so what the hell? And I wonder if we're doing the same thing here.
Thank you. And abstention? Yeah, second row, third row. Sorry, in the middle, just there.
Hi, this is Christiana from UNAM College. I'm abstaining mainly because of this House proposition that says you design a baby. So although I believe it's something that will happen and should happen, I think there should be a very strong ethical line to it. In the sense that, okay, so where do you draw the line of which attributes to change? And although I think it's very important to prevent illnesses, I don't think it's right to engineer a baby to the extent where you change its physical appearance or its physical attributes, because when does it stop being your baby? I mean, you said you wouldn't change anything in your children, so why would someone decide to have a child that doesn't resemble them, or it's not a product of them and their loved one?
Thank you. In the interest of time, we'll return to the main debate and our final pair of speakers for tonight. I know you are reticent, but please do interrupt them if you feel strongly about something. If you don't want to interrupt them, you can tweet me and I'll interrupt them. Again, tweet us at Cambridge Union as quickly as you can, and we'll see if we can stay on the same topic. But yes, do interrupt our speakers, because that's what they're here for. But for the speech they're also here for, we now, to close the case for the proposition, have Dagan Wells. Dagan is the group leader and associate professor at the Nuffield Department of... now, I'm not a scientist, so I can't pronounce either of those words. But gynaecology and something else. He is an expert in preimplantation genetic diagnosis. Dagan.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I feel a great weight on my shoulders having to sort of sum up for us, I guess. You don't really have to start interrupting now if you don't want to on mine. If you've been quite happy up to now, really don't feel that you have to change anything. I guess it's always struck me as very interesting how the fears and hopes in our society manifest themselves. Now, I was a child of the Cold War, really. I grew up mostly in the 70s and 80s, where that was in full swing. And of course, the great fear that we had in those days was the nuclear fear, the fission bombs, fusion bombs. And not surprisingly, being sort of immersed in this sort of hysteria that there was back then, it filtered into all parts of society, into our art, into our literature. And I won't give you a lecture on those. Being a small child at the time, I can hardly call myself an expert in the art and literature of the time. But I did like my comic books. And I can tell you the delight I had as a child reading how Spider-Man originated. And as some of you may know, he was bitten by a radioactive spider. Now, fast forward 20 years, and Universal Pictures makes a Spider-Man movie. And in that movie, Tobey Maguire plays Spider-Man, and who plays the radioactive spider? Well, actually, there isn't one, because the spider that bites him is a genetically modified spider. And all I'm trying to say to you really is, look what the fears are in society now. And we only need to look at the front pages of our newspapers to see them on a regular basis, and I'm not blaming you in particular, Tom, screaming out about this genetic thing or that. If you put genetics in the title, it seems to go straight to the front page. could have a genetically modified crop which isn't modified in any way other than it has maybe an additional vitamin added to it. And yet before it's even had a chance to be trialed for safety and benefits, it's already condemned as a Frankenstein food. So we have these very sort of, I think we just have to acknowledge that this debate is taking place in a kind of environment, not specifically this theatre, of course, but in a society where genetics has been given a bit of a bad press and is often viewed rather negatively. Now, when I was first invited to do this debate, I first of all said, thank you very much, it's a really great honour. And then I secondly said, I'd like to speak against the proposition. I don't want to undermine my argument too much, but so I'll quickly move on and say, they asked me anyway if I could actually speak for it. And I was very happy to do so, because this is not, I think as your comments have shown already, it's not a black and white kind of proposition really. There's actually many shades of grey. I hesitate to say there's 50 shades, but there's a good number, I think you'll agree. And so I think we've already seen that there's a lot of truth that's been said on both sides of this argument. But I'm happy to emphasize for you the ones that I think are important on the pro side of this debate. So I think, first of all, it's important to consider what is technically possible. And as Robin mentioned, as geneticists, such as I am, in the past couple of decades, we've had an easy sort of get-out-of-jail-free card whenever anyone's brought up ethics of this kind, in that we could just say, what's the point in having this debate? You're talking about things which aren't technically possible and probably won't be for any time into the far future. But, of course, things have progressed quickly, and actually we are now standing at the threshold of a time when it may become possible to do these sorts of modifications in human embryos. And so, of course, we have to have this debate now, and it's very good that places such as the Cambridge Union are leading the debate. You guys are the future leaders in our society. It's going to be down to you and your peers to really make the decision about whether we go ahead with some of these things. So it's key that you think about this now. What we have to say really is that if we have the tools, does that mean that we have to apply them in society? And does it mean that they are going to immediately be applied in the UK? The simple answer is no. This kind of embryo modification, and indeed just pure embryo research, is very highly regulated in this country. It would take an awful long time with a lot of ethical debate and assessment of safety before this could ever be permitted in this country. The embryo itself is highly protected, in some ways more protected even than a growing fetus. And that's all enshrined in law. And so we don't need to worry that this is something that's about to be applied for all manner of ethically questionable purposes tomorrow. We've also... Yes, please, go ahead. But make it quick.
Thank you, Matthew Wilson Downing. But what happens if the law ceases to work? If this technology is possible, there will be scientists who could potentially operate outside the realms of the law. When abortion was illegal, it didn't mean that there were no abortions practiced.
Yes, that's true. Thank you for that, Matthew. But I think what we have to acknowledge is this isn't like abortion where, dare I say, it could be done in a back street with a coat hanger, which, of course, you know, that's the horrific nature of what sort of thing used to go on. This is a very high technology thing. It's not something that you would be able to do in your garage or anything like that, thankfully. And I think, you know, we've heard nicely illustrated just how complex it is. This would rely on a couple using IVF technology. And we've heard that this is not a straightforward thing. Who would choose to really go down the roller coaster route of IVF with all its uncertainties? Only a third of IVF cycles actually result in a baby, after all. To do something trivial or like this. I think this is only ever going to be used for something where there's a real imperative to avoid transmission of a problem. So anyway, that's where we are now. What about the future? Well, if the process is shown to be safe, would it really be so wrong to correct a serious inherited defect in an embryo? If someone's dying because they need a kidney transplant, they They go on the transplant list, and we try and find them a kidney that's going to save their life. If an embryo has a mutant gene which is going to cause a child to be born that perhaps is going to die in infancy, maybe in pain, is it so wrong to consider a transplant of a small piece of DNA to correct that deficiency? Actually, organ transplant was highly controversial and ethically thought of as challenging when it was first proposed. So, really, is it that bad? And in fact, could you argue, I think some of my colleagues have already mentioned, is there not an ethical imperative that if you can stop a child from dying in pain, can you really sit back and not do something to avoid that outcome? I've actually met a lot of couples who've been seeking to avoid the transmission of serious genetic conditions. And I can tell you that sometimes I meet the couple and they know that they're at high risk of passing on a genetic condition because there with them is a little baby that has the condition. And the baby's full of life, beautiful baby. Sometimes I meet those couples again 6 months, a year down the line. Baby's not there anymore. That's a really, really difficult thing. So I would say to you that when you're considering this, think about the ethics, think about the safety, but don't forget about the families who this is going to have a life-changing impact upon. Don't forget, the human side of the whole of it. It's very difficult, I think, for any of us, but if we can try and put ourselves in their shoes, we should. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Our final speaker on opposition, if you are not a fresher, needs no introduction at all. Who is a fresher? Put your hand up. Okay, so you're looking at the former Member of Parliament for Cambridge, who has a deep place in all of our hearts from second year onwards. Dr. Julian Huppert is a Fellow of Clare College and a member of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and is formerly the Liberal Democrat MP for Cambridge. Julian.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be here, and welcome to all of you, no matter where in Cambridge you're from. And I have to say, Mr. President, you were saying it's rare to have scientists here. Perhaps we could help on some more debates that would attract more scientists, because I think it would be a great thing for the Union. Though I have to say, I'm very pleased we're not actually trying to design a baby here, because I think the series of referenda about hair colour, about eye colour, you've had some experience with referendums now, and I'm not sure we want to go down that route. But it's been a really interesting discussion about a really, really important subject. So I'm really pleased that it's happened. We've had some fascinating speeches from each side. Robin talked about whether people look for genes in their partners. Anybody going to admit to a Tinder or Grindr app where they say what genes they're looking for? Nobody, right, okay. And he had some real visionary things about photosynthesis. Could we be photosynthetic? A really good excuse to get out from that desk, get out on the fields, get some sun, get a bit more energy. Tom talked about three-parent embryos. I know he's now a journalist, but as a mathematician, he should know it's much more like a 2.0001 parent embryo, because there is so little there. And he suggested that this was settled. It was within a year that we had this debate. I spoke in it, I argued very passionately that we should allow this. And there's a big difference, and I'll come on to this later, between something like mitochondrial replacement therapy, where we're taking people who have horrible conditions that we know will die, in almost all cases in pain very shortly, and doing something to fix that from a full design. Now, interestingly, because Dagan said we're quite slow and it won't be here that we do things. And incidentally, I don't think that we should say that there's a bad thing which someone else should do, so we should do a bad thing here ourselves. We shouldn't develop chemical or biological weapons just because we think somebody else might do if we don't. Surely none of us would argue that. We are ahead of the game. We're the first people to license mitochondrial replacement therapy. We may well be ahead of the game in some of the aspects of this. And there's a question about what is design? What do we mean by design a baby? And we've had a few ideas, the photosynthesis and a few other ones, the visionary ones, and that attempt, sense, particularly from Dagan, to try to pull it back to fixing a few problems. Now, which one's the real design? Now, if you were told you could design your dream home, then it turned out what it meant is we've designed one for you, but we promise it won't fall down straight away. You wouldn't really think of that as a design. So what we're saying here is you shouldn't have the design in that sense of the blue eyes, the hair color, the extra intelligence, the extra height, whatever it may be. And our reasons, we've set them out very carefully, are about technical issues and about ethical issues. Now, the science is really neat. It's really, really interesting science. CRISPR-Cas9 is about as nice a piece of science as the name is a really silly name for such an important technology. It's really good, and some brilliant pure research, as we've already heard from Robin. The question isn't, can we do this? It's whether we should do it, whether we would do it. And I think there is this big difference between fixing problems, where we know that any risks, and there will be risks with any of these techniques, can be offset against the huge benefits, and the sort of design that people are saying they want, where there are huge risks, and we don't have huge benefits to set against it. And as we've heard so often, we don't really know how to sort things out. We know what's wrong with Downs, we know what's wrong with cystic fibrosis, with Huntington's, but most things, and Shirley's very clear on this, are just too complex. We don't know what produces height. There's loads of genes that are kind of involved a bit in some way or another. Intelligence, we don't even really quite know what it is, let alone what's associated with it. There's a lot of work on this. There's a program 10 miles south of here at the Sanger Institute called DDD, looking at serious developmental disorders in children. There is a huge amount we simply do not know. Even when you've got full genome sequence or full exome sequences of these children and their parents, we often cannot work out why they have the serious problems that they have. Our prediction is poor. Now, I know some of this because my girlfriend, who's worked with Hillary, is a real expert. I'm here for gender balance on our side of the panel. And she's done a lot of work, and to give you an idea how bad prediction is, she and some others sent off DNA samples to various of the different companies that will tell you what your risks are. And they had a look, and they all worked out that she was female, great achievement, but they all disagreed on other things. Her chance of colorectal cancer was either noticeably higher or noticeably lower, depending which company you ask. We have no idea whether we're trying to fix her or get others to be like her. They all did agree, though, that she is blonde and blue-eyed. Now, you know her. She's neither blonde nor blue-eyed. Apparently, her genotype is much sexier than her phenotype. So maybe you're right, we do look at some things through there. That's her line, by the way. So there is a question. If we could design people, what would we do? And what do we do about the fact that we would then have a separate set of people? We would see this separation. They wouldn't be seen as abominations. If you could do the sort of design about height, about intelligence, we're heading horribly towards the sort of Ubermensch that was touched on earlier. That is where we'll be heading if you have people who've been corrected, who've been fixed, who've been improved, and people who haven't. And that, to me, is the core problem. It's a problem of equity. We have huge health inequalities already. It's a huge problem. It's around the world. Some of you will know the American satiric magazine, The Onion. And a number of years ago, they had a headline, 15-year-old Somali boy has midlife crisis. That, unfortunately, is too close to the bone. And here in the UK, a developed country, we have huge discrepancies. Up in Glasgow, travel just 4 miles, you have a 14-year difference in male life expectancy. 8 years for women there. Take the Jubilee line south from Westminster, and you lose a year of life for every stop you take along it. It's a really dangerous tube trip. Here in Cambridge, which people may think is universally wealthy, it's not. We have an 8-year gap in life expectancy between people from the richest areas and the poorest areas. And this problem continues despite what we do. Children at 2 who are brighter from poorer backgrounds fall behind by the time that they're 5, compared to less bright children from richer backgrounds. But these are things we can, at least in principle, try to do something about. We can go there, we can help to make sure that people aren't trapped by the poverty. Yes?
Martha Thompson at Jesus College. Surely if there's problems with equality, we want to try and make everyone better, not keep everyone at the same level. Wouldn't it be better to try and seek improvement?
So this is a really interesting one, and I will come onto that in just a minute, because it is a really interesting question. The problem with this is, it's a done or not done thing. Either these improvements are made before you're born, or it's too late. If we miss you before birth, that's it. We cannot ever come back. There is nothing that we can do. If you're born having not been improved, that's it, condemned forever to be in the unimproved category. That is the big problem. So what you say would work if everybody had this. That's not going to happen, is it? Do we really think that the NHS, which is cutting back on IVF funding, is going to suddenly pay for everybody to have improvements? And I don't mean fixing particular disease, I mean the sort of design that we're talking about. Do we really think that that is what's going to happen? Do we think around the world everyone is going to do this? And let's remember that this can only happen if the child is born through IVF. If the natural-born children are there, they cannot have this. So you cannot level everybody up. It's a good point, but it unfortunately simply does not work because of when you have to do this. And that is the problem. Imagine being one of the unimproved. Let's imagine we can do the protection for Ebola, so 1% of the population are immune from Ebola, but you're not. Is that really a good thing? Or should we be trying to tackle Ebola in other ways, like actually providing more training and support in Africa? That is one of the big problems. Should this house design its babies to say that other houses elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world, well, tough luck, you can't do it. That, to me, is the big problem. If you like your philosophy, there's some brilliant work by Rawls, brilliant visionary philosopher. And even better, particularly for this audience, hopefully, there's a whole Doctor Who episode entirely about him. And he said the way you should think about some of these things is by imagining that before we come out into the world, we all gather together somewhere like this, not knowing who we'll be. We try and work out what the rules should be, not knowing whether we'll be rich or poor, male or female, straight, gay, whatever. What then would we want the rules to look like? And you'd want much more equality, presumably, because being really poor is a lot worse than the benefits of being a bit rich, and you're less likely to be that. Would you want to have a system where 1 or 2% of the time you were fine, and otherwise you were permanently different? I don't think anybody would want to take that gamble. We shouldn't take it with our society. So, can we design babies? Well, ish. We're getting there. Eventually we probably will be able to. But should we? Absolutely not. We should fix serious problems. We should not go down the route of designing the features we would like to see. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the debate.
Thank you, Dr. Huppert. What you now all want to do is move. Now, I understand that. I feel there's a deep urge within you to gather your bags together, like that guy just there. But before you leave, I need to implore you to do something. In about 2 weeks' time, the Cambridge IV is gathering. It is one of the biggest IVs in the country, where we have hundreds of debaters descending on Cambridge from all over the world. They cannot afford to get accommodation for themselves, and frankly, they shouldn't. The result of this being that we do a thing called crash. Crash is when basically as a student you volunteer to take debaters to come and stay on your floor. They literally just need a floor to stay on. In return for doing this, you get entry to the end of IV party where there's like free hog roast, free drinks, tokens, loads and loads of stuff. We have about 150 people who are currently homeless for the duration of this weekend. If you have space on your floor, if you have space at all, please look online, look on the Cambridge Uni Society's Facebook group, go outside and you'll find a debater there with a laptop. Please do take crash. If you have space on your floor, we would hugely appreciate it, and you'll be doing something very important for competitive debaters. Aside from that, I have to say that tomorrow the Chinese ambassador will be speaking at 5 o'clock. The Women's Public Speaking workshops are at 8 o'clock tomorrow. On Monday, we have Christian Guru Murphy at 5:30, and the Women in Academia Forum featuring Nina Ansari is 7 o'clock on Monday. The results of this debate will be announced in the bar in about 10-20 minutes' time. Please do go and grab a drink from the bar on your way out if you'd like to hear them. If you want to vote on the way out, if you want to, you physically have to if you want to leave this room. If you would like to vote in favour of the motion, exit via the door on the right. If you're against the motion, exit by the door on the left. If you would like to abstain, exit via the central door. We'll announce the results in about 5 minutes. Thank you very much and good night.